on the logistics of doing running sprint training in a city. So the essential problem is that in a city around where you live, usually there is no such thing as a track. Also, due to time efficiency, it seems to make sense that one just runs, therefore, on the sidewalks or on the streets. Now, because on the streets are usually cars and also trains and so on, there is this problem that you cannot really sprint properly without having to constantly pay attention to traffic and so on and so forth. Now, there is one big bypass to this, and this is due to basically the human circadian rhythm. Now, because the circadian rhythm for most people makes them sleep at night the streets are usually free. Now, the only real option I found where I could actually all-out sprint without having to wander constantly, whether somebody on the sidewalk, for example, is like appearing out of a door or something like this, is at night. In addition, one can actually do running on the streets. Now, especially if it is a little bit wet and I also wear barefoot shoes, it is very risky, I think, to run on the sidewalks. Also in winter, if there is ice on the sidewalks and also on the streets, but the streets, because they are usually made of not concrete but this other thing, they usually have way more grip. And especially if I'm really going all out, I found that I can only do this really on the streets. Now, there are different time windows, I think, that make sense. One of these would be basically in the normal break times where there is naturally less traffic, also during the day, but then at night it is usually the most free. Now, here is a couple of things I found about these night times. So first of all, it begins at around 10 p.m. in the evening, when basically there is like a slowdown. Not a slowdown, but where basically the streets are really beginning to empty. Then at around 11 or 12, one could see this already as a very good running time, but still, if one goes further, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, up until about 4. At 4 in the morning, it already... So let's say, okay, I sometimes ran at 6 in the morning. At 6 in the morning, there are already some people on the streets, which already is kind of a preventative again. Now, at 4 or 5 in the morning, it often is still not that crowded. Now, on weekdays, at these times in the mornings, it is very useful. So the streets are fairly empty. But on the weekends, on the other hand, depending on where you actually live and also where you run, there might still be the problem that many people are around due to maybe partying. Now, so therefore, so basically, one could just take the normal circadian schedule and right in the middle of it, it is probably, so if one usually sleeps, if most of the people sleep from 10 to 6 in the morning, then if one cuts right into the middle of this, which would be after 4 hours, so 2 in the morning, then the streets are usually the most empty. Now, in terms of time efficiency, running seems to be something that's particularly useful because one can just change into running clothes, go outside and start to run. So the only real time cost is the changing of clothes, then maybe potentially showering afterwards. It usually seems to make sense for me to shower afterwards. Also, if I begin to sweat, then I just want to shower afterwards. Even though that also means one then might do multiple showers in a given day, at least in my case, which then there is the water cost, not specifically the cost, but the cost also in terms of the environmental cost. But that's something that's in this case particular to me, I would say. Now, back to the logistics of running or sprinting in a city. There are also these other options available, which are called treadmills in the gyms. The problem with a treadmill in the gym, which I also tried to do for sprint training, is the following. You need to set them at a constant speed. Now, there are also these treadmills, so there are two types of treadmills. So first of all, the most common one is the one where you set a speed at a treadmill. Now, if you actually want to sprint, then the speed only goes up so much. Then the problem is that you kind of have to jump right into a treadmill that already runs at full speed. Why? Because otherwise so in terms of stopping the run and also in terms of timing the run, either you basically can do this thing where you constantly press on the button and then you begin to run, but if you want to do proper interval runs, then at least in my case it seems to make sense to also time them properly, which means I do 1 minute on and 1 minute off, at least for the ones at the gym. Now, if I do this, then basically if I would have the ramp up where I already am on there, also in the timing, then this would basically either dilute my performance measurement, which is the 1 minute and whether I can hit the certain speed on a certain incline, or and also it would already count kind of into the timing of the run, or I have to jump into it, which I over the last couple of, let's say 1 year, so over the last year, I kind of learned. Now this also could be a potential injury risk, because if one jumps right onto a treadmill that in my case runs at 19.3 kilometers per hour, that seems to be the maximum speed at which the Precor treadmill, at least in my gym, runs at, then this might be quite a little bit of a risk. What I also found is that it is mentally very, very demanding. Now, I often fear already days before the 3 minutes on this treadmill, I already began to basically have a crisis about it the night before, which seems to be kind of ridiculous, but I also do know that this is kind of the only thing that I can properly measure in terms of power output, because it is externally set. So if it is externally set, then I do not really have control. Now, because I do have a variance in my performance over time, then if I catch a bad day, or if I have eaten 2 kilograms of food and water before, or ingested, let's say, then I have the problem that I have a worse power to weight ratio, which then already means that at whatever I'm currently trying at, so currently the last couple, so the highest I ever got was 19.3, so the highest stack of 3, so I kind of do a drop set similar to the strength training in the gym, where I start at the highest incline, because I cannot go further in terms of the speed, so I start at the highest incline, which currently is 3.5, then I go to 3, then I go to 2.5. I did try a couple of times at 4, sometimes at 4.5 already, but I could not hold the next 2 intervals then at the 0.5 speed below this. So this is the first type of treadmill one can find at the gym. There is also now another type of treadmill that is basically a band which rolls because you run on it, and this seems to be something that's, at least in theory, allowing then the normal kind of sprinting behavior, that would also allow basically a more marginal tempo control compared to running on a treadmill. Now, also because I do these 1 minute runs at the gym, and outside I seem to usually, at least how I stacked it up and how it seems to make sense also with the street layout that is kind of around me, what I usually do is I think more like 20 to 30 seconds of sprints, which also are mentally way easier, because at around 20 to 30 seconds of an all-out sprint in my case, I begin to basically, I think it might be the case that ATP or also creatine might be already beginning to drop, so the creatine levels. So that I think in terms of creatine there is also triphosphate, and then there is diphosphate or D-phosphate, and so with ATP it would also make sense. So I think the first one is ATP, which is then broken down into adenine triphosphate or adenine, I don't know how it is properly pronounced in English, and then we also have KTP, which then I think delivers kind of again the energy for the adenine diphosphate to be again adenine triphosphate. So I think that the anaerobic capacity begins to already drop, at least in my experience, or it would make sense that it begins to drop after 20 to 30 seconds of an all-out sprint. Now, because of this, it becomes increasingly harder to hold this pace, and in the gym, then basically my heart rate begins to really ramp up at kind of the end. So in the beginning, I often don't really need air, so I can do the first type of the sprint. That could be the first 20 seconds also on the assault bike. I can almost hold my breath in, because I don't really need air. But then the heart ramps up, and also then it requires oxygen, so therefore the lungs begin to ramp up. And if I continue to try to hold a high pace at around 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 45 seconds, my heart rate, it's not necessarily my heart rate. I think in this case the respiratory rate is going up first and then the heart rate. So it would be, I think, fairly useful to have these other runners also available, but I currently do not have access to them because it does not make sense to just go to another gym just to do this. So in general, now for sprinting in a city, it is actually not that easy, I would say. There is also one other option, which is to sprint upstairs, but this also ideally is more done at night, at least if one also accounts for stair traffic. And so there's actually not really a great option, because if one wants to have one's own circadian rhythm kind of aligned with the rhythm of the sun, then the problem is that one would have to sprint at night, which then leaves this problem. Now, there are basically two ways out of this, which is to go on the outskirts of the night, and these are basically the time intervals, or the times when it would make the most sense, or when there is basically still an overlap between one's own optimization of circadian schedule, as well as basically still being able to use the low traffic on the streets and sidewalks. So this would be, first of all, kind of the late part of the day, and second of all, the early part of the morning. So this could be at 4 in the morning. I tried this a couple of times to run already at 4 in the morning. What seems to also be the case is that I need at least, I think, 30 minutes after I stand up until I begin to run, just because of I need to stand up, I need to do this and this and this and this. And so 30 minutes after would be 4:30, it also could be 5:30, but at 5:30 it's 30 in the morning. It's already, I think, beginning to become too crowded, because at 6 already cars are very much on the streets.